Well, likewise, I'm grateful to everyone for spending 2 weeks in this conversation. I hope it's helpful. I want to start off by just asking people for reflections from last week. If you have thoughts that lingered, questions, oh, there's an option here to turn on Q&A. I'll do that too so I can see Q&A. As well as chat. Just type it in the chat if that's easier. But if there were any questions or thoughts from last week, I'd love to hear that. One of the things that I was asking you to continue to think about is if you could see opportunities to draw from the number that is behind your number, the number that you step back into, what some people have called the growth number or the security number. But a part of what I was trying to do is shift that language so that we rely less on the idea of a stress and security number and more on the idea of resource numbers in different directions. I believe that's what so much of the Enneagram has to offer us, is movement or inner flow around the symbol as a pattern and a metaphor of sorts for what happens within us, that there is inner work churning within us all the time, and that inner work requires different capacities. We know the language that we are predominantly a thinking person, if you're a 5, 6, or a 7, or a feeling person, if you're a 2, 3, or 4, or a gut-oriented doer, if you're an 8, 9, or 1. So we know that we have that kind of center of intelligence that drives our personality, and we know we need balance in that. One of those drives us, one of those tends to get repressed. That's stance work. We talk about that sometimes. But any kind of growth requires balance of those characteristics. And a part of what these arrow numbers often do is help us to connect with a different characteristic. So we talked last week about how by shifting into a different characteristic, if you're typically a head number, it could help you get into your body. Or if you're typically a heart number, it could help you engage your head for balance. And drawing from last week's number is a way of looking back in order to look forward. There's a particular quote I used, I'll mention it again, from Iranio Pais, who teaches with Beatrice Chestnut. Beatrice's Enneagram Encyclopedia is called The Complete Enneagram. The website they use together, and I just have to Google their names each time to find it, Chestnut and Pais, P-A-E-S. I believe he's Brazilian. And I have a quote here from him. Where he says that with respect to the arrow lines, we must first go back against the arrow to the point connected to our type, and that direction, the back direction, to explore our relationship to that point and to integrate its lost lessons and overcome the issues associated with it. We must do this before we move on to the point connected to our type and the direction of the arrow moving forward. In other words, we must go back before we can go forward. So we have to look back and learn from one aspect of our personality in order to move forward in growth into a new way of being in our personality. And so much of the Enneagram is about that kind of inner flow, about health and overcoming challenges through a sense of balance. All right, I'm gonna pause. I see some comments coming in. I love it. Yeah, if you want to put questions in Q&A, you can do that. Otherwise, I'm gonna just look here. It's good. Matt's talking about the kind of strength-based approach to using the numbers, which I think is right. For too often, particularly this is one of the things that Aranio Pais has also said is that the American psychologist emphasized the pathologizing and emphasized that the number we're looking at today is a number associated with disintegration. That truly has that kind of negative connotation. And so to talk about how both of those are resources that we can draw from in different times and in different situations, I think is such a helpful and different approach to the numbers. I like Fran's reference to drawing from the high side and the low side of both of the numbers. So that's exactly what I'm hoping we can all kind of think about is how do we do that? A default of our personality. So when we're not conscious, when we're kind of unconscious and things aren't going well. So our typical response to a stressful situation is to demonstrate some of the worst characteristics of our personality, of our number, before, so you kind of bottom out in your number, Suzanne Stabile says, before you slide over to the negative characteristics of one of these other numbers. So you demonstrate kind of the worst parts of yourself, the worst parts of your number, and then as a 3, I can slide into some of the low sides of 6 and 9. What we have to do, and so much Enneagram work, so much personality work, so much spiritual work, is just practicing mindfulness, learning to be conscious of what's happening. How do I see myself behaving badly? How do I see the fact that my children are on my last nerve as something that I can take a deep breath, see it for what it is, and engage the situation differently, rather than just letting the stress take over and being the worst of myself, the worst of my 3-ness, the least patient possible parent. So seeing that coming on, I can be conscious of it, and then that helps me step into the high side of these numbers that we can draw from. So again, just as our number has a range of health characteristics from more healthy to less healthy, from higher developmental functioning to lower developmental functioning, so also the numbers that we draw from have those same characteristics. So I can be a healthier 3 or a less healthy 3. And when I slide into 6, I can be a healthier version of that or a less healthy version of that, or slide into 9, more or less healthy. So just with the 3, the reference last week was to 6. And so the negative slide is I'm impatient, and then I start second guessing myself. The anxiety kicks in of, well, it's probably never going to be any better. I probably will never find another way. And I start overthinking all the things that I've done wrong as a parent. So the negative anxiety, worst case scenario planning of the 6, coupled with the impatience drivenness of the 3, is a pattern I can find myself in. But I can also pause and say, okay, let me think through this with some clarity before I respond. That's a more mindful, healthy approach. Yeah, and then Fran also mentions learning to just think of it differently. Integration, disintegration, that there can be a positive connotation with moving, that moving backwards isn't negative. It can be something you do integrate. So that language doesn't have to completely go away. Disintegration is more problematic. There is something that we are drawing from or integrating into our personality from the security number. We might find security when we integrate something into our personality from the number that we look back on. So all of that language can have value. It's when it gets dichotomized, that one is good as one is bad, that we lose the possibility of seeing both as growth numbers, both as resource numbers. So that's what I want us to shift from, not necessarily losing the idea of integration, but not making it a duality of, if one is integration, the other has to be disintegration. That's where we kind of went off the rails in terms of Ennea thinking, was when we made that kind of dichotomized approach to one was a good number, one was a bad number, one was a stress number, one was a healthy number. Forrest's question there. I'm slowly making my way through both. Oh, let me just kind of finish this connection. Jen is kind of clarifying what Fran said. Moving backwards sounds more like disintegration. It's not moving backwards in terms of that. It's not like a backward step in your personality or a backward step in growth. It just means that the arrow is the reverse arrow. That's all that means by moving backwards in order to move forward. It doesn't mean move. It's not a well, it's not disintegration. I can't remember the psychological concept where you kind of regress. It's not regressing. It's just the number behind you. It's really is that simple. So the arrow on the Enneagram typically points in the direction that we'll talk about today. Typically, when people talk about the numbers, that when historically arrows have been drawn, the arrows are in the direction of 3 to 9 to 6 to 3, and then 1 to 4 to 2 to 8 to 5 to 7. And the arrows point that direction. And that is the stress direction, or what Riso and Hudson of the Enneagram Institute also labeled disintegration. So to get to Forrest's point and kind of tie it to Fran's concern about moving back sounding negative. The idea is that it's just looking in the opposite direction that the arrow is typically drawn. And what Riso and Hudson did is they took the idea that 1 is a growth number that you go to in healthy times, is how Suzanne often teaches it. And 1 is a stress number that you go to in stressful times. And Riso and Hudson kind of doubled down on that language. And they got the idea from one lecture that Claudio Naranjo gave, where he used the word integration, disintegration. And they kind of latched onto it and began teaching it. And later he came back and said, that's not what I meant. I don't think that's what Oscar Chazo meant or anyone meant. And so they kind of began to correct it. But by then it was already in their writings and on their websites. And you still see it on their website. The idea being that we might integrate something from the number behind us because it is a growth number. But again, the label of the numbers we're going to talk about today have often been seen as a stress number, and you go to it in stressful times. And as such, your stress can cause you to disintegrate in your personality, or disintegrate, meaning not integrating something healthy. So for me, and I'll talk through all 9 numbers again, that connotation, the negative idea of disintegrating or disintegrating, means that when a 3 goes to 9, they check out. And that is too often the case. I don't remember if I gave the example last week of my typical pattern, and my wife points it out at least once a week. She might laugh and say, no, it's every other day. I don't think it's daily, but it's pretty often. My pattern is that I go without stopping. I did it today. I kind of look back at my day and thought, oh my gosh, what was I trying to prove? Why did I feel like I needed to accomplish so much in one day? So I'm just going nonstop if I'm not really mindful. And even when I start my day, which is most days, I'm pretty good about practicing centering prayer. But an hour after, I've kind of lost the mindful function, and I'm just chasing my ego. I'm chasing the image of success, not thinking, but implicitly working to prove my worth. So it's getting things done, accomplishing things, sending emails, replying to emails as quickly as people write me so that they know I'm on top of it, making sure nobody thinks I'm dropping the ball or letting anything go, always trying to show what I can accomplish and achieve. And before I know it, the day's over. I come home. I tend to function the same way at home. So I'll walk in and I see a need for dinner. I see kids who need to do homework, and I see dirty dishes and dirty laundry. And I'm just go. Let's get some things done. Let's get all this moving. And of course, that leads to conflict when I'm not more present and able to have a little more sense of balance between my doing and being, between my doing and feeling. So the pep talk I give myself is, today I'm going to come home and be that parent who just sits down with his children and asks about their day and talks about feelings. And Fran, I need more for in my life, because I cannot find the feelings to do that. And so 10 minutes after my pep talk, I've lost the ability and I'm just in go, go, go mode again. Now, of course, I'm not always that way. I'm being a little hyperbolic for this, but thanks, Jordan. I'm nonstop, and I'm impatient, and I don't make connections when I function that way. But what happens is, after all of that freeing, if things don't go the way I anticipated or expect them to go, and I get frustrated with my wife and kids or somebody at work, and they argue back and things get more complicated, more complex, more frustrating, then I reach this breaking point where I just check out. And so, unfortunately, it's not that uncommon that by 10 o'clock, I'm just done with the day. I've had the last fight with the last of the teenagers, or I just got one more email from Baylor that I don't want to have to think about tonight. Instead of just letting it go, I feel the need to respond, but then I'm done. And I just tune out. I don't want to talk to anybody. Wendy asked me how my day was. I say, I'll tell you tomorrow. She knows I'm not going to come back to it tomorrow. I know I'm not going to come back tomorrow, but I'm done. That is the worst case of my personality, of 3 disintegrating into 9. So I'm impatient, I'm frustrated, I'm trying to get everything done. I can't control the situation like I want. And what happens is I am done. And so I take on those unhealthy 9 characteristics of, well, if I can't do it at hyper speed, then I'm just going to maybe not do it at all, or maybe I'll make a decision later. And sorry, 9s, perhaps you function that way. But when we function that way, when you function that way in the core of your personality, and when I function that way, when I slide over into that room that we share, I take on the worst of those 9 characteristics. That's disintegration. What we'll be talking about, thank you, friends. What we'll be talking about today is, well, how can I do that differently? How does it not have to be a disintegration number, a disintegrating from a healthy way of being, but another form of integration? How can both of these numbers be integration points or resource points? And there's different language that people use for that. A couple of things I want to highlight before we get into those numbers and talk a little bit more about this direction particularly, is to just think about the overall flow a little bit. And Aurelia kind of points out, how do we go from either or to both and? I'm not sure if this is what you have in mind, but that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is go to the both and kind of way of being. And one way to think about that is to think about some of the history of the Enneagram. So often what happens is it becomes a tool of personality. We get locked and loaded on our particular number, and we know kind of one story of how these numbers, other numbers work, but it's a pretty limited focus that we have on our core number, a couple of characteristics I can draw from, and then maybe a little bit of wing. And that's kind of it. It's kind of a limited path around the Enneagram. What George Gurdjieff in the 1900s, a century ago, was saying about the Enneagram had nothing to do with personality. He wasn't focused on labeling people with numbers or people identifying a number. That was Oscar Ichazo's creation, the idea that there is a psychological identity with 9 ways of being in the world. That is not a part of the ancient Enneagram. The ancient Enneagram was a symbol of holistic flow that we all participated in. Identifying type is an important contribution, it makes a lot of sense that that was developed by Echazo and Naranjo. And I think there's a lot of truth and meaning in that. But it doesn't mean we have to lose the ancient teaching of the inner flow of the Enneagram or of the process orientation. So classic Enneagram teaching associated with Gurdjieff is often called the process Enneagram. And what Gurdjieff often talked about was the Enneagram is a moving symbol, a living symbol, and a process-oriented symbol that we can associate ourselves with. So much of Gurdjieff's teaching was in story form, used a lot of metaphor. He had people come and live in an intentional community that they created. And he used the processes of functioning and living in community to teach the Enneagram, to teach this flow, not to teach personality type, but to talk about how we all move in and out of different ways of being. And he was really talking about these kinds of dynamic patterns that we now associate with a type and specific characteristics that we draw from for each type. The symbol was the same, so he knew that there was a certain way that a type 4 could relate to a type 2, and then could lean into a type 8, and then a type 5, then a type 7, and then a type 1, and then back to 4. But he talked about the fullness of that flow. What we do today is we say, well, 1 connects to 4 and 7, and that's kind of it. And 2 connects to 4 and 8, and that's kind of it. And 8 connects to 2 and 5, and that's kind of it. Gurdjieff would say, no, let's keep following the flow. Let's keep following the pattern, because we do have access to all 9 types. We just don't often learn it that way, because we have to identify our own type, we've learned to say. But Gurdjieff, that's a foreign concept in his teaching. The process Enneagram, the living Enneagram, would say all 9 are connected around the symbol and within the symbol, and we must continually draw from different elements associated with 9 different ways of being in the world. That there are 9 paths back to God, and we can draw from each path in a different situation and setting in life. Now, the 9s absolutely can see from their perch at the top of the Enneagram how to incorporate all ways of being. That is a part of the characteristic of 9ness, that their position on the Enneagram does matter, and they kind of see, you know, all possibilities are good possibilities to 9. They can merge with all 9 ways of being. That can also be a problem for 9s, but we all have to have a little bit of that within us. We all have to ask the question, what part of me is 5? When do I connect with my introverted thinking self, my observing the world and taking it into my interior through my head? Likewise, how do I do that with my heart from a 4 characteristic? How do I draw things in to my interior being through my heart and connect with my own emotional journey and the feelings that matter to me? And then how do I connect to other people's feelings in a similarly meaningful way, a 2 kind of characteristic? And then how do I not over rely on people's feelings, but set some boundaries and draw some lines? 8 way of being in the world. So follow around the Enneagram to see what we can learn from the 9 ways of being is a part of what Gurdjieff would have us know about the Enneagram. He did it by emphasizing a couple of different characteristics that make the symbol what it is. The symbol reflects a law of 1. There is a oneness to the symbol. It is all integrated and a holistic and unified, unitive approach to being in the world. So there is a holistic process of oneness in God and with God, out of which we all function from the diversity of all that we are as humans. We are a part of the oneness of God and God's creation. So seeing not just 9 ways of being, but billions of ways of being reflected by 9 paths And that oneness flow is, of course, a very piece of Christ's kind of way of thinking. And that is the heart of the Enneagram symbol. It is a symbol that reflects the oneness of God in creation and the created order within God. So how do we participate in that holistic, unitive way of being in the world? At the same time, the inner triangle is a Trinitarian way of being. There is an innerness, interior function within the one that is three, that reflects the Trinity, the fact that God is three in one, and the fact that we are as well. Not necessarily fully Trinitarian in a divine way of being, but a fully way of connecting with the divine from our human perspective, so that there is a part of the fullness of God within us. We are a part of the oneness of God. We are a part of the threeness of God. And we can draw from all the ways that we talk about the fullness of God in that way. And there are other aspects of threeness in our faith that we draw from that get connected to this inner triangle. So we talk about the 3 point as the point of hope. And we talk about the 6 point as the point of faith. And the 9 point is the point of love. And faith, hope, and love are found on a journey, a shared journey together. The threeness is a part of the oneness of how we are to live and operate in the world. And so the 3 in 1 functions as part of the Enneagram. And then to show an even greater diversity, there's the path of 7, the sevenness, the law of 1, the law of 3, and the law of 7. Now there's something a little ironic around the fact that the law of 7, the sevenness, actually only has 6 numbers, 6 lines that connect the numbers besides 3, 6, and 9. But that hexad shape of 6 refers to what is mathematically known as the law of 7. You have to go back and read some Pythagoras in order to understand what Gurdjieff was saying when he used that language. But it also goes back to some of the early church fathers, Evagrius of Ponticus, talk about these kinds of things as well. Here's a simple mathematic way of thinking about this. Most of you have a calculator with you at all times. If you would break out your calculators, we're going to do a quick math lesson as part of Enneagram Night here at Peace of Christ. Open your calculator. Divide any number, 1 through 9, by 7. One caveat, any number except for 7. 7 divided by 7 is 1. The fullness of 7 is found in 1. 7 divided by 7 is 1. That's true for any number divided by itself, reflects a oneness. That is theological beauty and simple Pythagorean math. But divide any number by 7, and what do you get? Literally, do that on your calculator and type in the responses in your chat. Any number, 1 through 9, divide by 7, type in the numbers that come after the decimal. Come on, play along with me. I need at least one other participant. There we go. Take it out 5 or 6 decimal places. Are you seeing anything similar? Are you seeing a flow? Recognize the last number is oftentimes rounded up. So we can shift that 9 in Jana's response and the 3 in Fran's. But what do you see as a common flow? Look at the Enneagram, start with a 1, look at the direction that the arrow is flowing. And the law of 7 simply refers to this mathematical theorem, fact, that within the law of 7 is this formula that shows a flow from 1 to 4 to 2 to 8 to 5 to 7. It's a way to help us remember what numbers the arrows point to when you're drawing the Enneagram. But it is a part of the flow of the Enneagram is in this mathematical formula. And Pythagoras, this is one of his recognitions of the ancient Enneagram symbol. And it helps us think about how we move in a particular direction that now we can call the forward direction. When you move forward on the Enneagram, it's in the direction of the mathematical law of 7. So moving forward is from 1 to 4 to 2 to 8 to 5 to 7. Of course, the 3, 6, and 9 are not part of that triangle. They really are a separate symbol laid over or under or within the hexad in the Enneagram. So it is a symbol of 3 and a symbol of 6 interposed on top of each other to form the symbol of 9 or the Enneagram. It is fascinating, isn't it? So here's some language that people have used to talk about this particular direction. I've already mentioned that this is moving forward with the arrow in the direction of these numbers we just saw, moving against these numbers. So if you start at the back of your decimals and move backwards, that's all I meant by moving backwards with the line last week. There's nothing metaphorical there or psychological about a move backwards, except for the fact to say that some people call the move backwards back to your soul child or your child point. So some people do say, it's pretty common in fact, and Beatrice Chestnut uses this, that we draw a lesson from early childhood that was needed, that wasn't fully integrated within us. So we look back to childhood when we draw from the numbers we talked about last week. And I did mention that briefly as a part of what we said last week. So if that number is looking back to a lost lesson in childhood, then today is drawing from that, moving forward to a potential future growth. So there is a flow looking back to childhood, recognizing we are in the present now, and then anticipating our future self and moving forward into a place of growth is a part of what this number can look at by looking forward. So it's not necessarily stress. It's not necessarily disintegration. So that's a part of why that number is somewhat limiting. It can be a stress function, as I mentioned, when I behave badly in 3 and then slide into bad behavior of 9. That is a stress response, but there is more to it because I can be my best self by drawing on healthy characteristics of 9. When I'm in overdrive as a 3, hyper functioning impatiently, I can be conscious, mindful, and I do this as well. My wife and kids would tell you on my good days, I stop and say, okay, let's take a break. Let's take a deep breath. Let's slow down and let's engage life differently. That's a growth way of looking at this particular number rather than just a stress orientation. So again, it's the psychological focus of Riso and Hudson that really use the language stress or disintegration, and a lot of people learned from them. But the narrative tradition is the tradition of David Daniels, Helen Palmer, Beatrice Chestnut to a degree, and Peter O'Hanrahan, I mentioned last week as well. A part of O'Hanrahan's writing, Peter O'Hanrahan, is that he calls it the resource point or the forward point. And here's what he writes about moving in this direction from Peter O'Hanrahan on the Narrative Traditions website. In the forward direction lies our resource point. This is a point where we can access some important quality that helps us take action in the world. Many Enneagram of teachers have called this the stress point because we can go there under times of significant stress, or we can go there to access the intelligence and competencies of that number, yet we find it stressful to do so. Both statements are true. But since stress point has a negative connotation, we are using the term resource point. It's not necessarily a bad thing, he says, but it can be very uncomfortable. I just love that. I love the idea that it's not growth or stress. We can be stressful in either direction. And we started this conversation last week thinking about where we find ourselves in this time of global pandemic, where we find ourselves in coming to terms in new ways with historic, unprecedented racism and white supremacy. The stress that that creates for us culturally, that we are trying to manage, that we're trying to address, does sometimes draw out the worst parts of our number, but does give us an opportunity to draw from any and every resource we can find. So to draw from both of the two immediate numbers that we are connected to only makes sense in these stressful days. And then to learn to draw from the other 6 numbers as well can be a gift for our personality. It requires us to be honest with ourselves, to see ourselves with clarity. It requires us to be mindful, to be introspective, to do the work of self-awareness that is at the core of the Enneagram. Step 1 of the Enneagram, I always say, is basic self-awareness. Step 2 is knowing your number. Step 3 is integration. But the basic self-awareness sometimes requires that we see how we behave badly, how we are not our best selves in times of stress. And so what O'Hanrahan says is that in order to be our best selves and draw from these other numbers and to access the intelligence or competencies of those numbers can be stressful for us. So it's just a different way of thinking about the stress point. And then it can actually be applied to either direction. But it doesn't mean that you go there in times of stress. It means you might need to go there in order to deal with stress, but going there can be stressful. So for me, to slow down, to get my bearings, to trust that if I take a deep breath, I will still be loved, I will still be able to do what needs to be done, all will be well, is absolutely stressful for me. And it requires energy. It requires a different way of being. It requires change. And this is an invitation to that kind of change within the Enneagram. So, in addition to what O'Hanrahan says, a couple of lines from Beatrice Chestnut, and then we'll get to the numbers. Chestnut says this is a growth point. And then she also says it is a growth through stress point. That it's a way of dealing with a specific challenge perfectly suited to expanding the narrow focus of one's personality. I am hyper-focused on accomplishment that makes me look good. Subconsciously, without even being aware of it, that's what drives me. And so learning to draw from 9 and to slow down and to focus on being and not just doing is a specific challenge perfectly suited to expanding the narrow focus of my personality, as Beatrice writes. So let's see what that means for all 9 types. I'll start with the ones again, give just a couple of quick points for each of the numbers as we wrap up our time together. Ones find themselves in situations of stress because of their need for order and control and perfection, a fear that it's not okay to make mistakes. So moving forward on the Enneagram invites you to connect with 4. You can connect to 4 in an automatic way, stress-induced, that can make you not only stay focused on perfection, but do it from a moody, melancholic, even more idealistic and withdrawn kind of way, or from a healthy orientation with some mindfulness, You can connect more deeply with the feelings that motivate your need for order and perfection. You can find a place for more creativity, a more authentic internal motivation, and you can trust that perfectionism doesn't matter. You can find more room for emotional expression at point 4. That's the opportunity for our ones, to be more direct about how they really feel and what they really need. 2s find stress when they are giving of themselves nonstop, when they give until they're empty, trying to find love, trying to nurture connection by caring for others. They continue to find themselves experiencing stress. And they don't believe it's okay to have their own needs or to have their own needs met by others. They're worried that people might begin to love someone else more than they love them. They are needy, and then they won't let people out of their sight. They give until they can't give anymore. And then they default into this 8 in an unhealthy way where they might blow up, where they might be over-controlling, manipulating. That's the less healthy way of engaging your 8 part of yourself. Or 2s, from a mindful place, can become boundaried. I don't have to take care of everyone else. I can say no. Here, advocate for yourselves more authentically. You can think productively about yourself and what you need. You can be more assertive. You can handle conflict in ways that don't overwhelm you, which is something that typically doesn't come easy for a 2, for fear of losing a relationship. But you can trust that others love you with boundaries, which is absolutely what the 8s have to teach us, specifically the 2s. 3s I've talked about, we want to be admired. And so we're on the go in ways that create stress. We're worried that it's not okay for our own feelings to show. So we just keep the smile on and just keep doing what needs to be done. We bottom out, becoming impatient, fear that we are not looking successful, creating that image of success. And then we bottom out after running at 110% and want to just check out and go to bed on the low side of 9. Or moving to 9 and the best imaginable way of growth, even though it's stressful, is on the high side of 9. We stop trying to over-accomplish. We learn that the world works without our achievements and we don't have to make everything happen. We can just be instead of do. We can become less directive and develop more body-based rhythmic patterns of activity and rest. What a gift the 9s can teach us, 3s. We can be in our bodies, open to different ways, different opinions, different points of view, and we can slow down in order to broaden that focus and see the world from different perspectives, like 9s do so well. 4s want to be loved. You feel the feelings of stress deeply. It can weigh you down. You can be stuck with those feelings. You can be fearful or anxious about being too happy in a situation like this. You can push and pull your way through trying to manage all the feelings that you carry. And so, in that push and pull, drawing from 2 and not so helpful ways, you can try too hard to be friendly. You can try too hard to connect, requiring assurances that relationships are good or okay, like an unhealthy 2 might exhibit. Or 4s, drawing from 2 in a healthy way, you can focus outwardly connecting with other people's feelings, letting them take precedence, their needs take precedence over your own internal needs to manage your emotional life. You can focus less on pain, less on melancholy, less on victim, less on fantasy, and tune into others' stories. Focus as much on the journey of other people's lives as on your journey. And twos do that so well, focusing on others in a healthy way. Fives worry that the world around them is too much. They need to understand it. They need to make sense of it in order to be okay. Other people's needs are stressful. People relying on them is stressful. They want to be comfortable and competent in the world, but it takes time alone for fives. They retreat into isolation. So fives can go to seven, and a pattern that we don't always associate with seven, which is frittering. Frittering is what Peter O'Hanrahan calls it. Frittering away time and energy, accomplishing nothing. Thinking about ideas, sharing ideas, but not necessarily accomplishing anything meaningful. Maybe excess reading and reading in circles. Maybe going down rabbit trails that lead to nowhere. It's frenetic activity. So it can be activity, and you can even engage others in it, but it's not meaningful activity. It's not healthy engagement of mind and body together. Moving to the high side of seven, you can connect with people like sevens do in a meaningful way, connecting rather than disconnecting, being drawn to good possibilities in life, and letting that lead you to participate in the world with others. Stopping the primary focus of observation, and focusing more on engagement. It leads fives in a healthy way to be more outgoing and more gregarious, like our sevens are. Sixes, as a part of their stress response to the world, they are planning for the worst. And they might tell you the year 2020 is it. They trust themselves in small moments when these things happen, but then they find it difficult to trust themselves again. Distress and stress seem to follow you, sixes. You can't get it out of your head. And you're afraid that it's not okay to trust yourself. You're seeking loyalty in order to find security. You're afraid of losing the support of your allies, those loyal connections that mean so much to you, but you're also unsure of yourself. And you ask more and more questions in stress. So you can take on a bad behavior of a three and become deceitful about your need to accomplish as a way to deal with the anxiety in your head. It might lead you to take shortcuts that aren't helpful. But at the same time, you can draw from a healthy way of being like a three, doing what is needed without overthinking it and with confidence, less analysis paralysis, as a friend of mine says. You can learn that you can achieve and see the value of moving quickly into action and achieving results in a more immediate way, like our healthy threes can demonstrate and teach us. It can be great relief for sixes to just do it and leave behind some of the excessive doubt and overthinking. It's a healthy shift for sixes to three. Sevens keep themselves preoccupied with possibilities, dreams, ideas, trying to avoid painful feelings that arise, seeking new adventures or instant gratification. So shelter in place is stressful for our sevens. But stress is inevitable. You want to be in control of life, but you can't. And you think it's not okay to be vulnerable or to share the pain that you inevitably feel that you're trying to avoid. It's not okay to depend on others either, which is really kind of a core struggle for you. So going to 1/7s in a not so healthy way, you can become dogmatic or controlling of others when they might not want to join you in your adventures. You can become pessimistic in your desire for control and then end up resenting others. Or you can connect in a healthy way on the high side of 1, as we say, by being useful and thorough and more detailed. You can engage in structure and with responsibility and an organized, orderly, and detailed way of being in the world that is more practically focused rather than just ideas that might not ever come to fruition. The practical focus can be a gift to those around you when you use that shift to 1. 8s are trying to convince others of their way of getting things done. Their passion and drive is what moves them as they're trusting their gut, trying to align other plans with their own. When they're not in control of that and when others aren't on board, stress is inevitable. They're even less interested in vulnerability than the 7s or the 3s. So 8s can connect to 5 when they're as hyper driven as they are. They can move into their heads and shut down. It can be a move to becoming more depressed in times of stress. 8s. 8s going to the low side of 5 is very similar to 3s going to the low side of 9s. That's one of those similarities we see in 3s and 8s, and they take on negative characteristics of both of their forward-oriented numbers and a low side. If I can't be in control and do everything that needs to be done, then I just won't do anything. Or you can make the choice to act more slowly, with more intentionality, with more insight and reflection, like a healthy 5. You can recognize limits to your energy that you don't think exist that might help you not burn out. Instead of your usual mode of charging into activity, you can focus on reflection and strategic thinking. Instead of over-investing, you can detach in healthy ways, like 5s are able to do so well. And then 9s. They're looking for patterns, they're looking for comfortable ways of being that don't cause conflict and that create harmony. That's difficult now in social distancing and quarantine. They're afraid others might make demands of them that they don't want to commit to, but they don't want to assert themselves, so it's easier to just check out or duck out or avoid. They want to defend their illusion that everything is just okay, which keeps them living in denial. And living in denial, you can draw from 6 in ways that can make you critical and anxious on the low side. You can take on worst case scenario planning and engage in pessimism. Or from the high side, you can recognize problems for what they are. You can think them through in clear ways with a little bit of healthy worry that motivates you as a 9. 9s need that little bit of a kick in the rear to get them going. And sometimes moving to the headspace of 6 does that for you. Pushes you to do something new by turning your thinking into action. Your perception is sharpened. You are a ponderer, 9s, but you can think more clearly. Instead of seeing all points of view, you can focus on specific ideas that need to be thought through carefully and critically, like a 6 can do in their best self. Then you can discern between the options that often keep you stuck and chart a clear course of action. 9s going to 6 in a healthy way. Well, there we have it. That was a quick tour through the 9 numbers and how you can draw from the number in front of you, the forward-oriented number. That's not necessarily a stress response, although it can be stressful to integrate that lesson, just like it can be stressful to integrate the lesson of the number behind you. But you can see how both numbers can contribute something that keeps you dug into unhealthy patterns on the low side, the less healthy characteristics of those numbers, or from a place of mindfulness, consciousness, self-awareness, you can take a deep breath, see another way of being, and these other 2 numbers specifically give you a resource for doing that. And the numbers we've talked about today are truly a resource number looking forward that might require something of you, but it will be worth it in terms of the potential for growth that the Enneagram absolutely can teach us and can be true in our lives when doing this kind of work. Well, we're about at the end of our time. I'm willing to take a few minutes for questions. If you want to post something, feel free to do that. I can try to take 1 or 2 in the last couple of minutes that we have. Some of you might need to sign off right at 8:30, and I want to let you do that as well. So I'll be mindful that some might need to duck out. But if people want to engage in conversation, I'm certainly open to reflecting on that. My hope for you as you go is that you will be mindful of all of the resources that all 9 numbers can contribute to your journey. Know your number. It's what matters most in terms of the beginning of self-awareness. But then hopefully you will continue to see all of the other numbers as a true resource for you on your spiritual journey. Thank you all for having me back.
Thank you so much. I feel a little exposed, honestly.
Don't we all? That is something the Enneagram does.
Well, this is a lot to process. Thank you for coming on again. What we had talked about wanting was a deeper dive into the Enneagram, and this really was it. So thank you for using your vast knowledge base and all your resources and taking the time with us. If there aren't questions, it's probably just because everyone's got a lot to process right now.
Understandable.
But thank you again, and please, oh, there's a comment there from Forrest.
How do they know me?
You're
right?
not,
but even though you're not supposed to do that.
You're not supposed to tell your kids what you think they are.
Okay, so here's a point to that. No, of course not. So here's one of the ways, here's another reason why paying attention to all 9 numbers matters within us, because our kids are also moving through all 9 numbers.
Yeah.
We've thought that one of ours was a 1, and he came to us this week and said, you know what? I've done some reading on the Enneagram. I'm a 7. 7s draw from 1. We saw those 1 characteristics and we focused on that rather than who he really says that he is. So yes.
And kids are going through so many emotions so much more rapidly, I'm sure, Sue. Yeah. So don't worry, Forrest. We're all wondering what our kids are.
Of course. Just don't box them in.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm gonna, I guess I'll end this if you're done, and we'll post everything on YouTube, and I'll probably need to listen to this several more times, but we're very grateful for you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.